The Penny Dreadful 500 is coming soon, and if you want to win, you should probably be bringing one of the best decks. Now, really, what you should bring to the 500 is the deck you've done the best with this season, or the deck that you have the highest win rate with. You shouldn't just play a deck just because it's better if you're not doing well with it. Because if you're not doing well with it in leagues or tournaments, you're not going to do well with it in the 500 either. Now, the 500 is not actually that close. It's like 2 weeks away. So why am I making this video now? Because, as I said, you should just play your best deck. So when I'm saying what deck you should bring to the 500, I'm more talking about what decks you should play before the 500 to see if you can do well with them. Because you should never use a video like this to just select your deck and bring it to the 500 as your first time playing it. But I think that you should try these decks before the 500 actually starts to see if you can do well with them, and then after that, you play the deck that you've done the best with in the 500. So I think that these decks are some of the best decks you can bring. You can do well with decks that aren't in this list. I think there are quite a few decks you could win with if you were good at them, but I think that especially 5 of these decks are what you really want to bring to the 500, because I think that, unlike previous seasons, the best decks, there are not very many of them, and they're quite a bit better than the decks below them, and I think there are 5 decks specifically. It's really 3 kinds of decks: High Tide, White Aggro, and Orzhov Control, that I think are a lot better than everything else. So I think that you should expect something like that to win, or just a deck that you're good with. Because it's possible that players are more important than decks in terms of who will win the 500. So High Tide is the first deck I'm going to go over. There is quite a bit of variation in lists, and this is my list. I would have shown Pascal 3000's list. They've done really well with it, but their results got deleted, so I don't have their list. But you have to play Hidden Strings, you have to play some cantrips, but you don't have to play strategic planning. You can play See Beyond as well, which is a sorcery that draws 2 and puts 1 card from your hand back in your deck. And then if you're doing that, you probably play less Dig Through Time. I like playing more of those though. And then Finale of Revelation, it's like Blue Sun Zenith, except it can untap your lands, and it can't target the opponent. Some people are playing that. I'm playing 2 Commit Memory as reshuffles. You do kind of need a reshuffle, because you might not be able to win without them. But I don't really like Finale. You already have Desire, and I think Commit Memory is probably just better. And I think that having a big payoff is not that important. Now, I know that some people have said that Desire is broken and like one of the best cards in the deck. I don't really agree. I think that the mana is way more important. Because if you have mana, you can just chain pieces and dig through times, and it doesn't really matter if you have Desire. Like, you could play 2 copies of Desire. I don't think it would be that bad. Though I think you probably should play 4. Though I do side them out in some matchups and go down to 2 sometimes. Against aggro, usually. And then the sideboard, you need a way to beat Lost Legacy. And the way I do this is to side in a Rise from the Tides and leave 1 in the sideboard for Fae of Wishes to wish for. And basically you do this, and then you tap them down, you hold up counter spells after you go off. The reason you need to do this is because if they extract High Tide, you can't make enough mana for Blue Sun Zenith. So you need an alternate win con. It doesn't have to be Rise from the Tides. I've seen Aetherflex Reservoir. It's pretty similar. I think that Rise from the Tides is the best because it doesn't really matter how you're actually winning the game. Like, if you draw your deck, you're going to win regardless of your win con. But I think Rise is better because if you aren't storming off, it can also win the game. Like against some random mid-range Lost Legacy deck, you just play this for, say, around 10 2/2s, and they just can't beat that. If they've hymned to death. Now the rest of the sideboard should probably have some kind of counter spells. Baral is really important for beating White Aggro. I'm not sure why I'm only playing 2. I guess I was siding in too many cards, so I needed less. Because you do really want to play a lot of cards for White Weenie, but you kind of have a lot of cards that you want to side in, and you can't side out that many cards. But Baral is really good at blocks, and then it's just hard to remove Sapphire, which is extremely important in the matchup because of Thalia. and it just helps you go off as quickly as possible. Though, one major problem with the white aggro matchup is you don't really have a good way to beat silence. A lot of people will misplay with silence from the white aggro side, and they'll play it on your upkeep, and if they do that, it's really easy to just like turn about their creatures, or maybe even repeal their creatures if they don't have that much, if they don't even have lethal through that. So you can beat a lot of players just because they use silence wrong, but if they don't, then you're going to need to either turn about them and their end step, or it's just really hard to win without it, because if they take both High Tide and a turnabout, it's really hard to go off again soon. But if they let you go off for long enough, you can potentially hold up a commit to counter it, or another counterspell that you sided in, but it's kind of hard to side in counterspells because you already want to be siding in a lot of cards just for the creatures. But you can play an offer you can't refuse. I usually only do that against auras, because they don't have as much to deal with. Like, none of the creatures are actually hate pieces, so I think you can bring that in against auras if you need to. But I don't think this is necessarily the best choice for the 500. I think it's the best deck for leagues, and very clearly not the best deck for tournaments, because it's bad into white aggro. So it beats everything else, but it's bad into white aggro. And I think it has a heavily favored matchup into basically everything other than white aggro. But there is probably going to be a lot of white aggro at the 500, which means you might want to beat one of the few decks. You might want to bring one of the few decks that beat white aggro. Alright, so next, mono white humans. You can play more colors, I wouldn't. So this is M-Dog's list that they won a tournament with. No Luris is interesting here. I think that Luris is probably correct, and I don't think Prelate is ever the reason. Adeline is a decent reason to not play Luris. I don't love it, but it's okay. And interestingly, this list doesn't have Flowering, which I think is definitely correct, at least as a 1 or 2 of. But you do have Thalia's Lieutenant as your anthem, kind of. So 4 Thalia is pretty necessary, 4 Thalia's Lieutenant, and then 4 Champion of the Parish is kind of the core of the deck. I think that Hopeful Initiate is definitely correct. I have seen people not play it, but it's just a very good card. Like, it has decent stats, except for if you play it on turn 1, it's not a 2-power creature on turn 2, but that just doesn't matter that much. Like, if you go 1-drop into 1-drop, 1-drop, like, it's going to be better than a Savannah Lions, just in terms of stats. And the Disenchant is actually really useful in quite a few matchups, just randomly. Deathblade Elite is an interesting choice. This card is really good with a Luminarch Aspirant and just buffs in general, because if it's bigger than a 1-1 and your opponent has 1-1s, you can just kill their creatures for free. But if they have multiple creatures, then that could be difficult. But like, for example, in the mirror, if you go turn 1 Deathblade Elite, turn 2 Luminarch Aspirant, and they play if they don't have a Savannah Lions, basically, then if they play a creature with less than 2 power, you just kill it immediately, so they just aren't allowed to play it if they have a Champion of the Parish or Hopeful Initiate. And even if they play a 2-1, then you can wait a turn potentially, but then they could maybe buff theirs, so it gets interesting. Yeah, also interesting against auras, because it kills every 2 mana play they have, because they all have 2 toughness. Though if they play the 1 mana thing, they can make that bigger than a 2-2. So at the sideboard, you play Silence, you play Canonist. So I think that Canonist is a lot better than Silence, because you really need it for the auras matchup. I think that's actually a pretty even matchup, maybe even winning for White Weenie if you play a bunch of hate in the sideboard, in the form of removal like Sheltered. I think there should be more Sheltereds in this list, in the main deck. This card is just so good. But you play cards like this, you play Canonist, you play some Disenchants. Settle is okay as well. And then you potentially beat auras or Evenish into it. This deck potentially beats basically every deck in the format, but it's not heavily favored into very many things. Like, it's slightly favored into basically everything, which is kind of the difference with Tide. Tide is losing into the white aggro and then really good into everything else, where White Weenie beats Tide but is only good into everything else. It's not like extremely favored against everything else. But there are some decks that have a really hard time beating it, for sure. Like a lot of random mid-range decks that I think are mostly just bad anyway, but It does beat up bad decks a lot harder than aggro in the past has. Just because we've gotten so many tools. We have Champion permanently, though we always had that before when we played White Weenie. But now we have Thalia's Lieutenant, we have Thalia. We have Luminarch Aspirant, and we just have better Savannah Lions, like hopefully Initiate. Which is, or 1-drops, I guess. But it's mostly Thalia's Lieutenant, Thalia, that we have new. Brave the Elements is definitely a point of contention in these White Weenie lists. I think they're pretty good just because they're so good in the aggro mirrors. But I'm not sure. I'm not really a aggro player. But I have played all these decks. So next, Auras. I do think that White Weenie is actually better than Auras, but I've heard people say that they're kind of similar, except Auras beats White Weenie, but I don't think that's actually true, because you can tech for it with Canonist as the White Weenie player. So this list, you play your creatures, you put a ton of Auras on them. Shelter is a huge part of this deck this season, and then Shard Mage's Rescue, just really good into removal. There's not a whole lot you can actually change in the main deck. So Test and Training, you can play Flying, you can play Trample. You always play... So you can play a different amount of SRAM and Scythus, I think. Or you could try Sanctum Weaver, maybe. I think this is too many SRAMs and Scythuses. Like, this is 16 creatures. I don't love that. Especially with these being legendary, I would play 3 of each, but you can do this if you want. This is playing a lot of silences for Tide, of course. It potentially is better than White Weenie into Tide, probably not, but interestingly, Tide actually has a hard time interacting with the Auras creatures, just because if they have a ward, if you have Shard Mage's Rescue, they just can't unsummon your creatures. So yeah, I don't think there's too much variation in these lists. It's really just how many silences you're playing. Curse is a little abnormal, I think, as well. So what else? Boros Legends, similar to White Weenie. You're playing a creature deck. So this deck got weaker as it was in previous seasons. Well, White Weenie got stronger, but still about as powerful as White Weenie. I think it is a little weaker, though. I think that being able to play Price of Progress just isn't very important this season. It's bad against White Aggro and it's bad against Tide, and it's not the best against Orzhov Control. Like, I think this list is weaker than White Weenie into Orzhov Control because they can play cards like Timely Reinforcements. And you also are just not necessarily weaker to Wraths, but like you don't have Flare of Fortitude to randomly get them. That's not that important, but I think you are just weaker to Condemn in general. And they have a lot of life gain, so having Burn in your deck just isn't very important, I think. But this list, I don't know if there's a lot of variation in lists. I think it's not actually that popular this season, because you can just play White Weenie instead if you want. This list only has 3 Thalia main, because we're playing a few non-creatures like Burst Lightning, Flowering, Sheltered, Pop. But you do have to play Luris, I think. You could try to play Adeline. I don't think that would ever be correct. It's a lot more important than in White Weenie, I think, because you have Hasters, you have just much better cards than White Weenie to get back. But yeah, this is very similar to White Weenie. I think it's probably mostly worse, but it's part of the triangle of High Tide, Orzhov Control, and White Aggro. So the 5th deck that I think is really good is Orzhov Control. So I don't think there's really any variation at all in these lists. Like, some people are playing a Wretched Banquet. It's a 1-mana black removal spell. Some people are playing slightly different sideboards. Persecute potentially allows you to beat Tide, because normally you never beat Tide without it, because Lost Legacy just does not work. And him is just not enough in this deck, because you just aren't really doing anything the rest of the game. With Persecute, you can go turn 2 Profane Tutor, turn 4 Persecute, and they probably just lose if you resolve that. I'm not entirely sure if that always works, though. Though I don't think everyone is playing Profane Tutors, but I think it is really good in this deck. But yeah, I think this deck is... So it's supposed to be the White Weenie killer, but it just isn't, I think. Like, it definitely beats White Weenie, but I don't think it actually wins by that much. Like, they have Thalia, which is a pretty big problem. They can play Flare of Fortitude, potentially. And the deck just doesn't have enough efficient single-target removal. Like, you have Condemn, and then, 3 mana Kai's Kyle? You also don't have card draw to find your Wrath, so you might just not draw one. But you do have Profane Tutor. That can be awkward against an aggro deck. And Kaya is just bad against aggro. Firina as well. Just doesn't do a whole lot against them. But Timely Reinforcements makes you a lot better against red aggro like Boros Legends. So yeah, this is a good list if you... because the 500 will probably have quite a lot of white aggro and probably not that much Tide. So I think that this could be a really good choice for the 500, just to try to farm the white aggro decks. I'm not really sure if there is a better deck, because this actually isn't that favored into white aggro, but I don't think there's really anything that's better into them. So I think that those are the best 5 decks. White aggro, high tide, Orzhov Control. You should play all of those 3, I think. You don't have to play... I would recommend playing Auras, White Weenie, Orzhov Control, high tide. Though if you haven't really played a lot of Storm before, you're probably not going to be very good at it. But if you have, I would definitely recommend trying it. And then you should play Orzhov Control, play an aggro deck. And ideally you would just play the best, whatever you did the best of those 3 decks. But if you aren't doing best with one of those decks, then yeah, you just play the other deck you're doing well with, which could be one of these other decks on here. I do think these decks are quite a lot worse than these 5, but they are still decent decks. So Blue Control is a little bit weaker than the other 5 decks, but it's still decent this season. The main problem is you never beat Tide, really. So the main difference between Izzet Control and Azorius Control is, I would say Azorius Control is a little bit better into basically the entire field, and then Izzet Control is just way better into Orzhov Control. I know that a lot of people have said that Azorius Control is bad this season and Izzet Control is decent. I think they are very similar in terms of power. It's just that Azorius Control has been good in a lot of previous seasons, and it's a lot weaker now, but it's still a good deck. It's just, if you didn't play it when it was really strong, why would you play it now? But Izzet Control, main difference between Azorius Control and it has invert polarity. Basically, that just means that if you ever win a flip against Orzhov Control, you just win, because you just take their walker, they never recover from that. And you also just have Galvanic Discharge, which can hit walkers, instead of, Condemn from Azorius, which does nothing against Orzhov. So yeah, just way better against Orzhov, but you don't have a real Wrath, is the main problem against aggro decks. The single turret removal is a little bit better, because Discharge is really good. And you make your counter spells a little bit better, your Ether Spikes. And of course, Invert Polarity is way better than Cancel, just in general, or Absorb is what Azorius Control plays. Most people are playing Chrome Host Sea Shark, which is interesting. So it's a sorcery speed creature, but it just makes a ton of stats if it survives, or if you play it on, say, turn 5 and hold up an Ether Spike. I think this is also just a really good body against aggro, a 2-4. They have a really hard time actually making something with more power. So just really good there. And it is just a really hard win con to stop once you started making incubate tokens, because it's just way too many things to deal with. They essentially have haste when you make them. And you just do them on your opponent's end step, usually. So the main problem with Control this season, the card advantage is terrible. You have Dig Through Time and you have Factor Fiction, but other than that, you don't really have anything. Which is probably why we're playing Chrome Host Sea Shark in most lists. You just want to kill them before it gets too late in the game, because you might not actually win the card advantage game. So yeah, I don't know if there's a consensus on the sideboards, but I think Gainsay is kind of bad, because I don't think you really ever have a good matchup into Tide. I think you get farmed by Tide basically whatever you do. I don't think Gainsay changes that. I guess it allows you to pretend you're beating Tide, or having a decent matchup into Tide, but I really doubt you're ever having a chance against Tide. I did lose this matchup recently as the Tide player, but I whiffed off memory for the second time this season, and the last time I won the next turn. And then I lost the next game because they drew 3 gainsays. So I don't think it's very realistic to beat Tide with this deck, but I'm not entirely sure how it is into aggro. I imagine it's a bit worse than White Weenie, though these Pyroclasms and Sweltering Stones are probably doing some work. Yeah. And you do kind of have the issue against Auras, where you just can't do anything once they've made a big thing, because we're not even playing Horn Lockwhale in this list. But yeah, so Azorius Control, very similar, but except I think it's a little better against like aggro, and then a lot worse against Orzhov Control. It potentially beats Orzhov Control with Approach of the Second Sun, but if you aren't doing that, then you are definitely losing to Orzhov Control, because they really just have to stick a walker and then you die. Because Trawler is never doing anything unless you've really taken over the game, which you can do if you counter everything they have. Him definitely makes that harder, because either Spike is actually a hard counter spell against Orzhov Control, I think, just with Fortune the narrative and the previous copies. But yeah, as I said earlier, there's really no reason to play this deck if you didn't play it in previous seasons, because it's just worse than it used to be. Like, it's still a good deck, but why would you not have just played it in a previous season if you wanted to play it? So there's some other decent decks. Aristocrats has seen almost no play this season, but it's still a pretty good deck. Though White Weenie has gotten a bit better since when this deck was good, and this deck hasn't improved much since then. Though interestingly, this list is a lot different than earlier ones. Like, it's playing Percussionist and Knight of the Even Legion. And before it was just Blood-Soaked Champions, Dread Wanderers, other things that return themselves. But now it's playing some, or I guess Eternal Paradox decided to play a lot of these creatures that don't really do anything on death, or don't return themselves. So yeah, so mainly the upgrade this season is Undead Sprinter. We used to have Forsaken Miner, but the deck was good before Forsaken Miner, though it's obviously worse than it was now that we don't have that. Though I think the main issue is, like, you're kind of the same deck as before Forsaken Miner was printed, like in Season 32, except White Weenie is stronger now. You do have a decent matchup into White Weenie. Really, you kind of have to draw Bombardment, though, especially since this list isn't playing Judith in favor of Luris. You kind of have to draw Bombardment if you want to be a white aggro deck. Or I should say White Weenie. You can beat Auras by playing Burst Lightning. Though I think Auras definitely beats this deck. It's too easy to play around the removal, especially with the Flash Auras. But I'm not really sure about how this deck does into other decks. I notice, so it's not playing him anywhere, which means it doesn't really have a chance into Tide, which is kind of a big deal this season. Like, white aggro is kind of just better into most things, and then just also it has a good matchup into Tide, where this deck just gets completely farmed by Tide. Like, this deck is not that fast. Like, you can kill on turn 4, it's not very likely though, and this deck has no real disruption. All it has is Mesmeric Fiend, so it's just a terrible matchup into Tide. So yeah, definitely worse than white aggro this season, but it's still good. So other decks. Enchantress has not seen a lot of play this season, but it does have all of its tools, except whatever it's called, the Shroud thing. That can also search for an enchantment, whatever it's called. I forget the name, but it has Scythus and Sanctum Weaver. Has your mana, has your Enchantress effect. So you play 4 Scythus for Enchantress Presence, you play the Wild Growths, you play Sanctum Weaver, and you ramp into... So you have your 2 of your engines in play, and then you have a ton of mana, and then you just play Solitary Confinement, and they can't do anything. You also finish the game with Sigil of the Empty Throne. This list is trying Aggravated Assault. This card is potentially worse than Jeskai Ascendancy, where it gives you infinite mana with Sanctum Weaver, except Ascendancy also potentially draws cards if you only have 1 Enchantress effect or none. Though Ascendancy has the problem of requiring 2 colors you don't actually play, where this deck only requires 1, and that's red. So Sanctum Weaver makes the red because this card is dead if you don't have Sanctum Weaver. But Jeskai Ascendancy requires you to have either blue or red from Abundant Growth or a land, or a second Sanctum Weaver. But interesting to have a combo. I think it's mostly because of Tide. But yeah, if you have an Enchantress's effect, this makes infinite mana with Sanctum Weaver, so you just draw your entire deck, and you're never losing to any deck after that. Which I think is mostly because Tide will just win through a Solitary Confinement. Though I think that current Tide lists sometimes lose to 2 Greater Oromancies and a Solitary Confinement, because their win con is either, like, even with Fae of Wishes to have access to their sideboard, they don't have a mass bounce effect sometimes. So if you have Shroud and they can't remove it, then they can't Blue Sun Zenith, and making zombies does nothing, because this prevents damage. So they just can't do anything and you win. Though if Tide really wanted to be Enchantress, all it would have to do is play a mass bounce effect and it would just win against Enchantress regardless. Like a desynchronization or something. But no one is really playing Enchantress, so they don't really have to respect it if they don't want to. They still probably win regardless, because you have to get 2 Greater Oromancies. And it's something the combo is just way slower than Tide. And Curse is too easy to remove and too hard to support for this deck. But I'm not sure about the white aggro matchup. They do have a bit of disruption with like Thalia, Sheltered by Ghosts, and a lot of enchantment removal in the 1-drop Hopeful Initiate. So I'm not really sure if it actually beats white aggro, but it could with, assembling the Solitary Confinement quickly. Well, this has no out of times main, so I'm not sure. But yeah, this deck is pretty much always good when we have the Scythus and Sanctum Weaver. It's really just, are people playing mass enchantment hate, because you're not beating that if you don't play Nevermore. Or you could try Karmic Justice. But yeah, I'm not really sure. It's basically just about, is it good into white aggro? So if you can beat that, it's probably a pretty good deck, especially since I imagine people aren't really playing the mass enchantment hate this season. So what other decks? So the other blue control pile, not that one. So 2 for 1 for 2 has been playing this deck. You play Chrome Host, Siege Shark like Izzet, except you don't get Invert Polarity, but you do get him to Turok. There are actually very few black cards in this list. No blue removal, or no black removal except for the Wraths. Interesting. So that's just because of the Storm Drakes. That's why you play Unsummon. So it's more of a tempo deck, really. I think 2 for 1 for 2 played some lists without Storm Drake, which probably have more black removal spells, I'm not sure. But yeah, if you want to play blue pile, you can basically do any of the removal colors and it'll be somewhat good. Though I imagine this is a bit worse than both Izzet and Azorius. I'm not sure how this is into white aggro. Probably pretty bad. So that is it for me. There are definitely some decks you could do well with not here. Like, I know some people have done well with Engineers, Jeskai Ascendancy, which is mostly just a worse version of Tide, but if you're not that good at Tide and you're good at Jeskai Ascendancy, you could play that. There are other decks you can do well with, like random combo decks potentially, though they do have the problem of being a bit worse than Tide, and kind of, like, why would you play them when you could play Tide? But yeah, just play the deck you're doing well with if you want to win the 500. The deck you have the highest win rate with. But if you're playing leagues mostly, expect more white aggro than normal. So try to play a deck that is not just losing to that, and ideally you're beating. If you play tournaments, there'll probably be less white aggro than in tournaments, because there are a lot of those in tournaments. Which is good for Tide, that there are probably going to be less. Like, I think Tide is actually not that good in tournaments because there's so much white aggro, and there probably won't be too much in the 500. It was probably going to be really popular still. But yeah, those are the decks I think you should try out before the 500. See if you can do well with them. And yeah, it's kind of my general idea of what decks are the best as well.